issues at play, two major issues. Number one is the efficacy of the ARB process itself, whether or not it is in our best interest to allow any entity to essentially grade its own papers. We don't do that in any other category of life. We don't get to sentence ourselves when we're in court. We don't get to grade our own papers in the classroom. The other aspect of the efficacy of the ARB is who they interviewed and who they didn't interview, whether or not they have to accept recommendations or don't have to accept recommendations. That's a separate issue to me, is whether or not the ARB process works, whether or not it has shortcomings. The second issue is, let's assume arguendo that the ARB process works. Let's just make that assumption for the sake of argument. Is anyone following the recommendations of the ARBs? Mr. Secretary, I want to read something to you. We are disturbed at the inadequacy of resources to provide security against terrorist attacks. We are disturbed at the relative low priority accorded security concerns, and we praise the ambassador for seeking security enhancements long before the attack. Do you know what that comes from, Mr. Secretary? What I just read?
I believe it's part of the Accountability Review Board report.
From 1999. That was
Bushnell and Nairobi, correct?
That was the ARB from 1999, and you can lay it almost perfectly over what happened in Benghazi. And one other point, the 1999 ARB made it really clear. They went out of their way to make it clear. They were disappointed that the recommendations that came after the bombings in Beirut were not being implemented, something called the Inman Commission. So the 99 ARB criticizes existing State Department employees for not following the Inman Commission from 14 years prior. That is a quarter century's worth of recommendations. And yet here we sit. So what I want to do, because I honestly commend Mr. Schiff. It was a wonderful idea, and I thank each of you for coming. But giving the inescapable interconnectivity between recommendations made after Beirut and after Eastern Africa and now after Benghazi, we're going to look at some of those past ARB recommendations. And I'll give you one, Mr. Secretary. For diplomatic buildings abroad not meeting Inman, of course, Inman being, again, Beirut bombing, not meeting Inman standards, essential physical security upgrades should be made immediately. That was the recommendation of the 1999 ARB. Mr. Secretary, I'm going to read you another one. This goes to Mr. Cummings' point, which I thought was a wonderful point. Diplomatic petitions should be made to all governments with whom we have relations to remind them of their obligation to provide security for our embassy. Who in Libya were we to call? Who? Mr. Cummings' point is a wonderful point. It was so good, the 1999 ARB made the recommendation. Make sure the host country is aware of its obligations. Who did we call in Libya?
Question, sir?
Yeah, when I pause, that's generally an indication I'm waiting on you to answer, but I'll make it more clear in the future.
I think this is the heart of the question. There are times when, for the national interests of the United States, we are going to have diplomats, humanitarian programs, rule of law programs, and other things in places where the host country does not have a government. In those cases, we must take the lessons from this ARB.
Was there a government in Libya for us to contact?
No, not at that time.
All right. So that recommendation of the 1999 ARB, we were not able to do. Let's move to one that perhaps we were able to do. This was also a recommendation from the 1999 ARB. And again, the ARB is presented to us as a panacea. I mean, that's the evolution of what happens, is there's an attack, there's a blue ribbon panel, we're going to study it, we're going to make recommendations, and this is never going to happen again. So back to the 1999, the Secretary of State should personally review the security situation of diplomatic facilities, closing those which are highly vulnerable and threatened. Why do you think the 1999 ARB went out of its way to use the word personally?
No comment, sir.
Is the answer privileged? I mean, that's a recommendation from the 1999 ARB. The Secretary of State should personally review. And I'm asking you with all due respect, we're not going to get to the word review. We got to get past the word that modifies review personally. Why did they think it was important that the Secretary of State himself or herself personally review?
I think ultimately the Secretary, who bears the responsibility for the security, has to be brought the information that is necessary for him to make decisions. That is my job. I have gone to the Secretary of State on different occasions, and we have talked specifically about the security of different places. Tripoli was one of them in particular since I have been back. But we have also looked at Sana'a. We've talked about Kabul. We talked about the other locations as well. Where I have concerns about the safety and security of our personnel, and if I believe that we are not doing the things that we need to do, then it is my responsibility to bring it to the Secretary.
And I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary. Was it done on September the 10th of 2012? Was it done prior to Benghazi? Because this recommendation has existed for more than 10 years.
I was not here at that time. I'm sorry. I cannot tell you.
Well, your answer mirrors what the 1999 ARB further said, which is, first and foremost, the Secretary of State should take a personal and active role in carrying out the responsibility of ensuring the security of U.S. diplomatic personnel. Is that being done now, and was it being done prior to your tenure?
In the time that I was here previously, and I have served under multiple Secretaries of State, I have heard every Secretary talk about the importance of security. I have heard every Secretary state to the personnel of the department that security is their function. Their personal security has to be their function. And that goes from Madeleine Albright, that goes through Secretary Clinton, Secretary Rice, and with Secretary Kerry, who has also made those statements and has made statements that the safety and security of our personnel is absolutely one of our highest priorities.
And I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary. But again, I think words have consequences, and they have meaning, and most people use words intentionally. And the 1999 ARB intentionally used the words personally and active. That, to me, does not mean talking about something. A personal review is not simply talking about it. Is the personal review ongoing? Is that ARB recommendation still accepted, I guess is my question. Does the State Department still accept these recommendations from the 1999 ARB, and is it being done?
Yes. I think the best and clearest example that I can give you today is a new process that we put into place, the VP process, the Vital Presence Validation process, where we, again, look at what are our vital national interests and why should we be in these high-threat, high locations. We put this process up, and it goes all the way to the Secretary.
And